and welcome to another episode of Coffee with My Friends. I'm Teresa Bruce, and we're going to continue our study in the book of Numbers, which is in the wilderness. And we're just about done with it. We've done almost every chapter in the book of Numbers. We only have 2 more teachings to go. So grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and let's get studying on the book of Numbers. Now remember, we have been studying what's called the restoration. And the restoration is when Messiah comes. Now typically in the Christian world, we look at this as the second coming of Jesus. And when Jesus comes, he will set up the kingdom and have the millennial reign here on earth. From Jewish teaching, though, the Messiah will come and restore all things. And remember, we've been talking about it. When Messiah comes, he will restore 4 things. He will restore the land. He will restore all 12 tribes. He will restore the temple. And then finally, he restores peace by defeating Israel's enemies. So we've been going through all of this by studying the book of Numbers and looking at the prophetic meanings of each of the stories in the book of Numbers. Now, this one we're going to be studying as the second to the last teaching in the book of Numbers, and this is called Mattot, or Tribes. And these are the things we're actually going to be covering today. We're going to look at the law of vows and see how they actually relate to the end time vows well, you'll see. The next thing is we're going to look at the war with the 5 kings of Midyan and what they mean prophetically. Purification by fire and water. And then finally, the establishment of the camps of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. So we're going to take a look at those things today. So let's start out with the law of vows. When a man makes a vow, this is where we're going to start in Numbers chapter, well, we'll get with that first, wait a minute. Numbers chapter 30, and we start with verse 2. And this is the law of the vows. So when a man makes a vow, he's not to break his vow. So let's take a look at this. Then Moshe spoke to the heads of the tribes of the people of Israel. He said, "Here is what Adonai has ordered. When a man makes a vow to Adonai or formally obligates himself by swearing an oath, he is not to break his word, but is to do everything he said he would do." Now this is a really important principle in the ancient Near East, is the idea of making a vow. Remember, in the ancient Near East, they live in an honor-shame society. Here in the West, we live in a society that values right and wrong. But back then, and in Middle Eastern countries now, it's an honor-shame society. So if a person makes a vow and breaks it, it's like he's made a covenant. If he breaks that vow or covenant, then he has to pay the penalty for that. The breaking of covenant is death. So it's a very serious thing. Now in the Middle East, what you see in an honor-shame culture is if a person is brought up to a high place of honor, then that's a really wonderful thing. However, if the enemy shames them and brings them to a lower place, then they have to, in a sense, do retribution to bring themselves back up to a place of honor. So you have this battle going on right now in Israel between the Jewish people and the Palestinians, and it's an honor-shame reversal battle. So the Palestinians want to shame the Jews and put them under, where God is trying to raise his people up to a place of honor. So you're seeing this honor-shame reversal in a constant way. That's why in the Palestinian concept, the Jewish people have shamed them by taking their land, and it's a constant battle for regaining their honor. So that's kind of the background behind this. So we're going to actually look at, real briefly about the vows. I'm not going to read this whole section, but I'll give you a synopsis here of the different types of vows and how they relate to us prophetically. Because remember, as the bride of Israel as the bride of God, we have taken a vow as well. Israel has made vows, both historically and as a church or body of believers. Taken vows, broken vows, renewed vows, and so we're going to see some of those connections. So, right, the first thing we looked at here is when a man makes a vow, he's not to break his word. But we're not going to look at the men in detail. We're going to look at the women. So these are what happens when a woman takes a vow. So let's see now. This is chapter 30, verse 4. When a woman makes a vow to Adonai, formally obligating herself, while she is a minor living in her father's house, like she's a young girl, she's not married, Then, if her father has heard what she vowed or obligated herself to do and holds his peace, then all her vows remain binding. But if on the day her father hears it he expresses his disapproval, then none of her vows of obligation she has bound herself to will stand, and Adonai will forgive her. So we see here in the first example, it's a minor. So this is a young girl who is not of marrying age yet. Typically back in the ancient Near East, a girl will marry about the age of 12 to 14. That's marrying age. As soon as a young girl is ready, has reached puberty, she is ready to be betrothed or promised. Often young girls were promised in marriage when they were children, and they were promised to a young boy. So the parents would get together. They'd have suitable families. They want to join their families together. And you think of Fiddler on the Roof, the matchmaker, 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 make me a match. That's what that's all about, is that you have a young girl and a matchmaker who's finding a husband for her. And so she matches them up. And what we have is a match made in heaven. Some cases, not so much. But then the young girl is then betrothed. And when they are both of marrying age, when the young man now has been apprenticed and is able to support a wife, and the young girl is old enough to begin having children, then they will go ahead and go through with the marriage ceremony. So this is the idea of a young girl who's still in her father's house, under her father's authority, and under his protection. Now, if she makes a vow, the father is able to break that vow if he doesn't like it, or he can allow her to go ahead with the vow. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. This is a woman who is engaged. Now, if a woman who is betrothed to a young man, but they're not married yet, because remember, in ancient Jewish society, the husband and wife, they get married, but they're only considered really betrothed to each other. And that betrothal can last up to 2 years. So the husband will go away and prepare a place to live. He will prepare his career. He will prepare to bring his bride home. And it takes 1 to 2 years to do that. The wife, in the meantime, maybe she was betrothed or married at 12. She'll have 1 to 2 years to prepare herself for her husband, to learn about what her husband likes, the foods he likes, learn about his family, and be prepared to go and join herself to her husband and live in his father's house. So this is a young girl who is now engaged, ready to be married. Now what happens if she makes a vow? Let's see. This is verse 7. If, having made vows or rashly committed herself to an obligation, she gets married and her husband hears, but holds his peace with her on the day he learns of it, then her vows and obligations she has bound herself to will stand. But if her husband, remember this is a betrothed husband, expresses his disapproval on the day he hears it, he will void the vow which is on her and the obligation to which she has bound herself, and Adonai will forgive her. So this is what happens. A young man, they're about to get married, and when he takes responsibility, if she's made a vow when she's engaged, that's what we would call it an engagement, he has the obligation or ability to both annul the vow or approve it, depending on what it was and how it affects him. And we're going to look at these and different vows in a couple minutes to see how they relate to us as the bride of Israel as well. So that's the engaged woman. Now, the next one is the widow or the divorcee. So suppose a woman was married, her husband dies, she's no longer married, and so she's a widow. So she has no husband to, in a sense, protect her, to annul her vows, or to confirm her vows, or she may be divorced, because people were divorced back in this time as well. She has no husband covering her. What happens to her? This is the next section here. This is verse 10. The vow of a widow, however, or of a divorcee, including everything to which she has obligated herself, will stand against her. So you see, in this case, the woman who's widowed or divorced, since she does not have a husband to protect her, that she has to stand by her vows. So if a widow, for example, takes a vow to work in the temple for the rest of her life, which is what we saw in the case of Anna in the New Testament, the prophetess Anna, she will have to carry out that vow for the rest of her life. There is nobody to annul that vow for her. So a widow and divorcee had to be very careful what they vowed, because they are not covered by any supernatural covering, nobody to protect them. So they had to go ahead and carry out their vows. And finally, the fourth type of woman is a woman who is married. Now, her husband can annul the vow or confirm it. So let's take a look at that. This is verse 11. If a woman vowed in her husband's house or obligated herself with an oath, and her husband heard it, but held his peace with her, and did not express disapproval, then all her vows and obligations will stand. But if her husband makes them null and void on the day he hears them, then whatever she said, vows, or binding obligation will not stand. Her husband has voided them, and Adonai will forgive her. Her husband may let every vow and every binding obligation stand, or he may void it. But if her husband entirely holds his peace with her day after day, then he confirms all her vows and obligations. He must let them stand, because he held his peace with her on the day he heard them. If he makes them null and void after he has heard them, then he will bear the consequent guilt. So you see here that a married woman, she's under the protection of her husband. If she makes a vow and he hears it the day she makes that vow, then he can annul that vow and void it out. If he approves it, then she has to carry it out. If, for example, then he hears about it and he hears about it later, then he still has the opportunity to annul it and void that out. If he lets it stand, however, if he doesn't annul that vow, she's obliged to keep that vow. If she breaks it, it's his fault. So that's a really big deal. There's a lot of prophetic implication in that. So let's make some connections here on what does this look like as the bride of Yahweh, or Israel as the bride. We sometimes say the bride of Messiah, bride of Christ. What does this look like when we vow and make a vow? All right. The law of vows. So the bride. Now, again, we've talked about if you don't understand ourselves as the bride of Messiah and how Jesus came and redeemed us and is betrothed to us, you can go back into my covenant series. And I taught on this under the New Covenant teachings. There's 2 New Covenant teachings. And you'll see how Yahweh had to divorce Israel, but then Yeshua came to remarry her, right? And betroth himself to her again, so that God can again remarry the bride. So if you haven't seen that teaching, it's a really interesting teaching. Go to the covenant series and then look at the New Testament or the New Covenant, and there's 2 parts to that, and that'll explain the background of that. But in this case, okay, a minor, her father can annul or confirm it. So for example, Israel as a minor, as a young child, you see a lot of language in the prophets where God said that she was a young child, and then he cared for her and he took care of her. She doesn't know very much. She doesn't know well, she's not very wise, I guess. And so Yahweh, the father or the husband, can annul Israel's vows when she's young. Then we can look at the example as the engaged, the woman who's engaged, the bride who's engaged to her husband. This would be Israel who has met the father at Mount Sinai, right? This is the book of Deuteronomy. It's the book of Exodus, where Israel's taken out of Egypt, brought into the wilderness, and then marries Yahweh, or himself, God himself, at Mount Sinai. That's the marriage covenant. That's where they're betrothed, all right? Remember the idea of being betrothed. So she's engaged. Her betrothed can annul or confirm it. And so Israel's vow at Mount Sinai was confirmed, and they went into covenant together, all right? There were a lot of things that happened. We had the breaking of covenant by the golden calf incident, but I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that right now. But understand that God was able to annul their vow and still betroth himself to her. Right? Okay. The next one is the widow or the divorcee. Now remember, the widow or divorcee is obligated. And this is the one that's the most interesting to us prophetically, because we have the ideal of Israel was, the greater Israel I'm talking about, was married to Yahweh as his bride, his precious wife. She broke covenant, she committed adultery, you see this all in the prophets, and then he divorces her, right? Okay, so she's divorced, widowed, it's broken. And so this is where we see here, Israel committed adultery and was divorced. So we're going to look real quick here at Isaiah 28:15, you can see on the screen. This is where Israel or Ephraim has made a covenant with death, which is very interesting. Now, Ephraim, as you understand, is the kind of prophetic name for the northern kingdom of Israel. So greater Israel divided into the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was divorced and then taken off by the Assyrians and taken to the nations. So it's the 10 lost tribes, right? Israel is called Ephraim in the prophets. And this is talking to Ephraim in Isaiah 28. Verse 15. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death and with Sheol, we have made a pact. The overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by. For we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. So, that means Ephraim has made a covenant with death at some point. And this, again, as you understand, history repeats itself. I believe this covenant of death was made at multiple times during the last, how many years? 2,700 years that Ephraim has been divorced. So what happens? Yah himself says now he can annul this. So let's go on a little bit farther here. And Yah annuls their covenant with death. This is Isaiah 28:18. Your covenant with death. And if you see here on the screen, I'm going to show you real quick. This is an Aleph Tav word. An Aleph Tav, death. Can you see that right there? And remember what we talked about in an Aleph Tav, anytime there's an Aleph Tav, it is pointing somehow to Yeshua as Messiah, his work in his first or second coming, or something prophetically. So this is an Aleph Tav, death. It's that Aleph Tav is a marker saying this is related to Yeshua in some of his work. Okay? In this case, your covenant with an Aleph Tav, death, will be annulled. And your agreement with, there's the Aleph Tav again, Aleph Tav, Sheol. So that we can see it right here. Your agreement with, see right over there? Aleph Tav, Sheol. Again, Sheol is the place of the grave. So this is the Aleph Tav, Sheol, will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, you will be beaten down by it. So this is a prophecy in Isaiah saying that he himself, Yahweh himself, will annul a vow, a covenant with Aleph Tav, death. So there's a good example of a widow or a divorcee, northern kingdom of Israel, who's been divorced by Yahweh, making a vow, a covenant with death, and that vow being annulled. He is breaking that covenant with death, which is great news for us. I wish we had time to get into Isaiah 28 more, because there's all kinds of really neat prophecies about Yahweh marrying us back again, and you can see Yeshua all through this, and it's very cool, but we don't have time for that. So anyway, okay, so that's the law of vows for a widow or divorcee. Now, prophetically, the law of vows for the bride when a married person, this is a married woman. Now remember, her husband can annul a vow. So let's look at an example here, again, in the book of Isaiah. This is Isaiah 54:4. So you can read along with me over here on the screen. You will forget the shame of your youth, no longer remember the dishonor of being widowed. For your husband is your maker, Adonai Zaviot is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He will be called the God of all the earth. For Adonai has called you back like a wife abandoned and grief-stricken. Now here we look. We're talking about a wife right now. A wife married in her youth cannot be rejected, says your God. Briefly I abandoned you, but with great compassion I am taking you back. Right there we see this is a wife, someone who was married to Yahweh, and he loved his wife. He married her in his youth. This is like a prophetic statement. It's when she was still young and just still a virgin bride. He married her, like we said, at Mount Sinai when they made the covenant together, and he could never completely reject her. You see so many places in the prophets where he says, how can I reject you, Ephraim? How can I let you go? I love you, my darling bride. So he talks to Ephraim like a bride who has been rejected. But again, he annulled the vow of death with her and brought her back into covenant. How did he do that? Through the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua, our Messiah. That was an important reason why Yeshua came the first time. I know there's a lot of question as to, for the Jewish people, as how did Jesus do the work of a Messiah? Well, in order to gather all 12 tribes, especially the 10 lost tribes, back to the land, he needed to redeem divorced Israel, Ephraim, the 10 lost tribes, bring them back into covenant, back into marriage, annul their vow with death, annul the divorce. In a sense, he had to die and make her a widow so that Yahweh could marry her again. So this is where that all comes in, where Yeshua, as the Messiah, Messiah ben Joseph, we talked about that, remember? Messiah ben Joseph had to come, redeem divorced Ephraim, bring her back into covenant. He had to die, make her a widow, so that Yah could marry her again. Because remember, the law states, the Torah states, that a man cannot marry a woman who's divorced. When she's divorced and put away, another man can marry her, but the original husband cannot marry her back again. So, here we go. Yahweh was able to marry her back in because she was a widow, and he could marry her. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I know that was a lot of information packed around that one little couple minutes. But again, if you want to find out more information, go back to the covenant teaching on the new covenant, and you can see I lay that all out step by step for you. All right, so that's the information about vows. That's the first part of this Torah section, is all about vows. And as you can see, they apply to us prophetically in the end of days. So if we're looking at our timeline and what we've been talking about in the book of Numbers, at this point in our timeline, we've been gathered out of the wilderness, and we're being brought back in, and then God has to annul the vows that we've made. Okay? Hope that makes sense. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about here in the Torah portion is that the next thing that happens after this law about vows is that Israel goes to war. And this is chapter 31. So I'm just going to start at the beginning of that. Adonai said to Moshe, on behalf of the people of Israel, take vengeance on the Midianites. After that you will be gathered to your people. So this is just before they go into the land. And just before Moshe dies and is gathered to his people in heaven, he dies. So Moshe said to the people, equip men from among yourselves for war. They are to go and fight Midian in order to carry out Adonai's vengeance on Midian. You are to send to the war 1,000 men from every one of Israel's tribes. So, out of the thousands of people in Israel, 1,000 armed men from each tribe, 12,000 altogether, were mustered for war. Moshe sent them, 1,000 from each tribe, to the war. He sent them, and Pinchas, the son of Eleazar the Cohen, to the war, with the holy utensils and the trumpets for sounding the alarm in his care. There it is. We talked about that in our previous teaching on Pinchas, the priest of war. See, this is where we see the connection between the 12,000, 1,000 from each tribe. And if you go back to the teaching on Pinchas, the priest of war, you see in the Hebrew there, the 1,000 is mentioned twice. And that gives us the idea of 1,000,000. If you do that same thing with 12,000, 12,000 times 12,000 is 144,000, which is the 144,000 of the book of Revelation. That's just one possible interpretation of that. And you can see Pinchas is the type of Yeshua, getting ready as the priest of war to go out and fight against his enemies. So, here we have in the slides, we have Pinchas, the priest of war, was their leader. And we made that connection to Yeshua as the prince of, the commander of the Lord's army in the end of days. And who did they fight? They fight the 5 kings of Midyan. Right? This is talking about the Midianites. But there were actually 5 kings. And this is kind of a parallel to the 5 kings that Abraham fought as well in the battle where he tithed to Melchizedek. So you see this repetitive pattern. There's the 5 kings, and they all have some prophetic meaning. Well, what we're going to look at are the Hebrew meaning of the names of the 5 kings, because again, they give us a look at end-time prophecy. So who are these 5 kings? Look up on the slide here. We can see the first king was Evi, and that word means those who are greedy. The next king is Rechem. That means a garment of many colors. The next king is Sur, and in the Hebrew that means a rock. The next one is Hur. It looks like Chur, but it's Hur, and that means it's a hole. So it could be like a hole or a cave, right? And then finally there was Reva, and that means four corners, four directions, four sides. So we can make you, I bet you're already catching some of this if you have studied the book of Revelation at all. Let's make some connections here. Let's compare the names of these 5 kings to a coming end time judgment in the book of Revelation. So, Evi, let's start with that one. Those who are greedy. Remember when we talked about the judgment of quail in the book of Numbers, remember the people were greedy for meat and they were tired of their travels in the wilderness, and so God sent them quail. And we found that the word quail in Hebrew meant a life of ease. So the people, what they were greedy for was the good life. The life back in Egypt where it was easy and they had leeks and garlics and they basically had they could have fish, they had whatever they wanted. Very similar to what it's like here in America. It's like we have anything we wanted. We have the internet at our fingertips. We have, just run down to the store, pick a store in your town. And you've got 10 stores to choose from. And you can go down and, I need to go pick up some dinner. So I'll just run down to the store and pick up something. So in a sense, we have a life of ease. And this is what this first one is talking about. Evi, those who are greedy. So the first judgment is of those who are greedy for quail, which is a life of ease. So if we're looking at this first war and we're equating it to the judgments of Revelation, the first thing that God begins to do is kind of winnow out those who want to go back to Egypt. Those who want the life of ease. And they don't want this hard life of being gathered in the wilderness. Right? Hope that makes sense. Okay, the next king here is Rechem. It means a garment of many colors. Well, of course, we're going to jump to Joseph and the coat of many colors, because that's where we first hear of this type of idea, variated colors, many colors, is that Joseph was given a coat, a covenant coat of many colors. Now, that covenant coat represented the authority of the firstborn son. Now, if we go back to the story of Jacob, Jacob had his 12 sons. Reuben was the firstborn. Typically, he would have been given that coat of many colors, which was a kind of a symbolism for the authority of the firstborn. He was going to carry on the responsibility and take care of all the family. The firstborn responsibility was to take care of the family, make sure they were all taken care of, that they had food to eat, that they were protected in times of war. They had their proper allotment of land. So the firstborn kind of was the estate manager, if you will, for the rest of the family. Well, Reuben disqualified himself for that position. He was the firstborn and he should have had it, but he disqualified himself because if you go back and look, he slept with his father's concubine. He was no longer righteous. So the next person who would have received that would be Joseph, because he was the eldest son of his second wife. Remember, Jacob married Rachel and Leah. He married Leah first. So legally, Reuben was the son of Leah, and he was the first in line. But Rachel was the second wife, and Joseph was the firstborn son of the second wife. So Joseph was next in line to receive the covenant coat of the firstborn. But what happened? His brothers got jealous of him, and they threw him in a pit, and then they sold him to Egypt, and then he was carried off to Egypt and was a slave, and then they told his father that he was killed. A wild animal ate him. And he believed it. Poor Jacob. I feel sorry for him. Anyway, so what happened to Joseph? Joseph goes off to Egypt. He's a slave for all those years. And then at the very end, Pharaoh calls him in. He interprets Pharaoh's dream for him, and he makes him the ruler over all of Egypt. Second in command of Pharaoh. So Joseph is a type, in a sense, of two things. He's a type of Yeshua, who is one of the children of Israel hidden in the wilderness because he looked like Egypt when his brothers finally found him. At the same time, he's a type of Ephraim, or the 10 lost tribes, lost in the nations, who look like Gentiles. And at the end of days, they will reveal themselves as being Joseph. And oftentimes in Israel, the Jewish people look at those of us who have come out of Christianity and begin following Torah as being like, they call them Joes. It's like they're Josephs. Hey, I'm a Joe, you know. That's kind of a nickname for a Joseph. So that's kind of the background story of this. So you see in this one, Rechem, a garment of many colors, is the judgment of Joseph or Ephraim. Joseph, Ephraim, has come out of the nations and is being divided now. How many of these Joes are going to follow Torah? That's going to be the question. So it's a division or judgment of the Joes, the Josephs, those who have come out of the nations, discovered Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah, discovered Torah and begin to follow Torah. Now, they're going to have to be divided. How many of you are going to follow Torah? And how many of you are going to stick with the old pagan ways? That's going to be the question. The next king is Tsur, which means a rock. And I'm going to put him together with Kur, which means a hole. And we're going to compare that to Revelation 6, right? And remember in Revelation 6, we see the kings, rulers, generals, rich, mighty, slave, and free, hid themselves in caves and among the rocks and the mountains. Okay? So if you remember, the book of Revelation is a huge earthquake, and all these things are going on at the very beginning of the, right after the four horses of apocalypse, right? You have this big earthquake, and all the leaders and everybody's hiding in the holes and the rocks. I believe that these kings are linked to that time period. Now, if you've not seen my teaching on the four horses of Revelation, I link those to the rise of Amalek or radical Islam. And you can go back on my website and look for the four horses of Revelation, and it's a really interesting study if you want to take a look at that one. But so the four horses are the radical Islam has been released. The land is being attacked. There's a large shaking that happens, and all the leaders and people who do not follow Yahweh hide in the holes in the caves and the rocks. All right? So that's kind of what that's talking about right there. And right after that, well, okay, hold your place there in Numbers. I got to go there. Hold your place in Numbers. We're going to go to Revelation real quick. I sure hope you brought your Bible. Don't ever study with me unless you have your Bible, really. Because I like going to the Bible. All right, so we've just finished chapter 6, where the earth, the kings, the rulers, the generals, rich and mighty, everybody hid themselves in caves and rocks. And they said to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne and from the fury of the Lamb. For the great day of their fury has come, and who can stand?" This is chapter 7. "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth." What is this next king but Rivah? It means 4 corners. Hello! So we are at the very next thing right here in Revelation. We have the angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. And what do? They're holding back the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind would blow on the land, on the sea, or on any tree. What are the 4 winds for? The 4 winds are sent out into the 4 corners of the earth to gather in all 12 tribes. That's what the 4 winds are for. They're not for the rapture. They're not for any kind of strange catching up in the air. They are from gathering all 12 tribes, including those who are lost, Ephraim lost in the nations, and gathering them out of the nations back into the land for the end of days, back to the wilderness. The whole thing we've been talking about, the whole book of Numbers is the book of the wilderness, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. So these angels are released, the 4 winds are released, and they're gathering everybody back into the land, into the wilderness, into a gathering place where these judgments happen and these divisions happen. So we see in a synopsis of this is Revelation 7, angels were standing at the 4 corners of the earth, ready to release the 4 winds to all 4 directions. The very same meaning of Revah. 4 corners, 4 directions or sides. I hope you liked that kind of a comparison, because I thought that was really cool. All right, so the next thing that happens, actually keep a marker there in Revelation. We might be coming back to that again, because we'll see right after the Battle of Midyan, towards the end of that, we have, this is Numbers 31, verse 21. Let me go to the next slide. We have the purification by fire and water. So, Eleazar the Cohen said to the soldiers who had gone to the front, "This is the regulation from the Torah which Adonai had ordered Moshe. Even though gold, silver, brass, iron, tin, and lead can all withstand fire, so that you are indeed to purify everything made of these materials by having them pass through fire. Nevertheless, they must also be purified with the water for purification. There we see fire and water. Everything that can't withstand fire, you are to have go through the water. On the 7th day, you are to wash your clothes and you will be clean. After that, you may enter the camp. So they've just had this huge battle, and now there's the purification of fire and water. And I had this on the screen here so that you can see it, but you can also read it in your Bible. But this is an important prophetic judgment. I'm going to say it that way. Because what do we see in the book of Revelation over and over? Fire and water as judgment. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. If you want more examples, I would say go ahead and do a study on this, because you're going to find a lot of references to fire and water as judgment, both in Revelation and in the prophets. You can actually do a study in the prophets. You'll see the same thing. But we're going to look at a couple of these. The first one, fire in Revelation 8. These are some of the things that happened. Remember, one of the things, the angel throws fire down on the earth. Revelation 8 are the trumpet judgments. All right, I told you to hold your place. Let's go back over to Revelation again. Look at Revelation 8. The Lamb breaks the 7th seal. So we just finished the seals, the 7 seals, and we get into the 7 trumpets. The very first thing that happens in verse 5, the angel took the incense bowl, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it down onto the earth. And there followed peals of thunder, voices, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So the first thing that happens, the angel throws fire down on the earth. And then we get into the first 3 trumpets, and each of them deals with fire or fire and water. So let's look at this. The first trumpet. The first one shouted his shofar or trumpet, and there came hail and fire, mingled with blood, and was thrown down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. That's the first one. Hail and fire thrown to the earth. The second one, this is Revelation 8:8. And this one is trumpet burning, a second trumpet burning mountain. The second angel sounded his shofar, and what looked like an enormous blazing mountain was hurled into the sea. What happens? A third of the sea turned to blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So it's a mountain of fire, basically. And then we have the third trumpet, which is a fiery star. Fell on waters. We have both, fire and water. The third angel sounded his shofar, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky onto a third of the rivers and onto the springs of water. The name of the star was bitterness, and a third of the water became bitter, and many people died from the water that had been turned bitter. Excuse me, I didn't mean to cough. So it's the fiery star that fell on the waters of bitterness, and this is called wormwood. But if you do a word study in wormwood, you'll see wormwood is used in the prophets as a form of judgment and a type of the bitter water. Think back to the story of the woman who is accused of adultery. She has to drink the bitter water. It's a judgment of bitter water. That's what this is talking about. So those are some of the examples, and we'll go into more detail when we talk about water in a minute. But these are the examples of fire, and there's many other references to fire. All right, let's look at water. Water in Revelation. Okay, I just mentioned the blazing star called bitterness or wormwood on the waters, causing the judgment of the bitter water for the woman accused of adultery. And this happened a couple times where someone has to drink water. If you think back to the golden calf incident, what did Moses do? He came down from the mountain, saw them worshiping a golden calf, took that calf, ground it into dust, and threw it in the water, and made them drink the water. Because they were adulterous. They just committed adultery by worshiping a golden calf. He made them drink the bitter water, and a lot of people died. I think it was 3,000 people died that day from the bitter water. It's the same thing of the woman, the law of the woman who is suspected of adultery. She has to go to the temple with her husband. They take the dust from the temple floor, put it into the water. They write all her accusations on a scroll and then wash that off, all the ink off with vinegar into the water, and she has to drink it. If she's guilty, then her belly swells up and she dies. If she's innocent, she doesn't die. So again, the judgment of bitter waters. This is what wormwood, or the star called bitterness, is talking about. It's the judgment of the adulterous bride. Now, I know there's a lot of teaching out there right now that wormwood is a planet, Nibiru, that's going to come by the earth and cause all these disasters. That may happen. I don't know. But I do know what this refers to, because the Old Testament is our dictionary. If there's something we don't understand in the New Testament, especially in the book of Revelation, all we have to do is go look it up in the dictionary in the Old Testament and we can get our definition. Wormwood, or bitterness, deals with the judgment. Bitterness deals with the judgment of the adulterous bride. This is what this is talking about. Now remember, the book of Revelation is full of symbology. A lot of the things that are talked about in here is symbolic or prophetic language. So some of these things may be physical, some of them may be spiritual. And I hope someday to actually do a teaching on the book of Revelation to kind of show some of the prophetic symbolism in this and terminology. But I hope that part of it makes sense anyway. This is the judgment of the adulterous bride. Okay. Then we have in chapter 11. I won't go turn there right now, but you see the two prophets. They're turning water into blood. They have the ability to do that. They can call fire out of heaven. They can turn water into blood. So again, talking about judgment of fire and water. And then in chapter 12, we see the serpent spews water out of his mouth to sweep away the woman, Israel, the woman with the clothed with the sun, that one, right? So the serpent spews water out of his mouth. That's the judgment of water, but she is rescued. And we're going to look at that in a little more detail in a second. Now, understand the ancient Near Eastern concept of judgment of water. In the ancient Near East, water was a sign of judgment. If a person was accused of a crime, they would tie them up and throw them into the river. If the person came out of the river alive, they were innocent. If they drowned, however, they were guilty. And the gods judged them, the ancient gods judged them being guilty. This is the background to the children of Israel, the babies being thrown in the water in Egypt. When Pharaoh made the pronouncement that all the firstborn sons, all the boys, were to be thrown into the river, that was a sign of the ancient Near Eastern judgment. If those babies were innocent, they would survive. However, if they were guilty of some crime against Pharaoh, or as Pharaoh thought that they would rise up against them to overthrow them, those babies would die. Now it doesn't make any sense to us in our modern day, but in the ancient Near East, that was a very common practice. So when Moses survives the water of judgment during that time period, he was put in that little basket of reeds. That's why Pharaoh's daughter took him out and raised him. He survived the judgment of water. The god of the river deemed him innocent, so Pharaoh allowed him to come into his household and raised him up. That's the meaning behind that. Now, if you'd like to know more detail on the judgment of water in the ancient Near East, Rico Cortez has a wonderful teaching on that. And you can get on his website, Wisdom and Torah, and look for the judgment of water. And he's got a great teaching on that. So finally, the very last thing we're going to look at here in this Torah portion is the establishment of the camps of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. So after all the battles have been done and everything is all meted out, then this is chapter 32. The descendants of Reuben and the descendants of Gad had vast quantities of livestock, and when they saw that the land of Azer and the land of Gilead were good for the livestock, the descendants of Gad and Reuben came and spoke to Moshe, Eleazar the Kohen, and the community leaders. And basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to keep their livestock and their families there on the other side of the Jordan. So Moses went to them and said, are you rebelling against the Lord? You're supposed to go fight with us. All 12 of the tribes have to go fight. And they made the agreement that the families would stay on the other side, and then they themselves would go, and the fighting men would go fight. But let's look at the prophetic implication. So the people of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh are going to be hidden in the wilderness on the other side of the Jordan while the battle rages. Now, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, you know that those names have meaning in the Hebrew, and what the meaning actually fits right here in this context. So in Hebrew, the name Reuben means behold a son. Gad means attack or invasion. Manasseh means increase, or they will increase. So prophetically, you could see over here, you can see I have Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Behold a son. the attack invasion will increase. So at this time period, prophetically, we can look forward to the beginning of the battle for the land. After everybody's been gathered in the wilderness and judgment has been made and divisions have been made, the adulterous bride has been judged. Yeshua, as the priest of war, has divided out the people, who's going to follow Torah, who's not going to follow Torah. The attack or invasion is going to increase now. And then what happens? Moses allows their families to stay in a place of safety east of the Jordan River. What does this mean prophetically? Revelation chapter 12. This is the woman clothed with the sun, right? So let me read this for you. This is verse 13. And you can follow along on the screen. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled down to the earth, he went in pursuit of the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly to her place in the desert or the wilderness, where she's taken care of for a season and 2 seasons and half a season away from the serpent's presence. I believe that this section here, the story of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, is a prophetic look of those who cannot fight in the battle being preserved in a camp in the wilderness, a place of safety. So we have the bride being gathered. And if you think of the bride of Israel, all 12 tribes, some people are going to be able to fight in the battle. Some people are not. There's going to be women, children, elderly, and people who are infirm, who first they got there, but they are not able to fight. So I believe that Yeshua is going to create a place in the wilderness, a camp, if you will, a camp of safety, where they are hidden during the battles of the end of days. So let's recap this to sum up. What did we learn today in Mattot or Tribes? First, we had the law of vows. Prophetically, they mean that our Heavenly Father annuls the vow of the bride and annuls the covenant with death. So we are remarried back into the covenant. We had the war with the 5 kings of Midyan. And we look at that as the judgment of those greedy for ease, the judgment on unrepentant Joseph, judgment on those hiding in the holes and the caves. And then the 4 winds are released to the 4 corners of the earth. We have the purification by fire and water, which we saw as the judgments of Revelation. Then finally, the establishment of the camps of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, which were the innocents who will be hidden in the wilderness in the place of safety. Well, I hope you enjoyed this teaching on Mattot or Tribes. Next week will be our last teaching in the book of Numbers, and this one will be Masai, which means stages. And that is the stages of the journey of the people of Israel in the wilderness. And what we're going to look at, we're going to research and talk about the Hebrew meaning of the 42 camps in the wilderness, and how they look, what they look like prophetically, because every single camp had a Hebrew name. Every Hebrew name has a prophetic meaning, right? So I hope you're enjoying this study on the book of Numbers, and we'll be wrapping this up again, and then I may do a synopsis video after that to kind of give tie everything together. But next week will be the last study on the actual book of Numbers, and that'll be stages. So join us again next time for another cup of coffee and another study in the book of Numbers on Coffee with My Friends. Shalom.